Iran moved first. Fast boats surged into a narrow lane of the Strait of Hormuz, cutting across the path of a U.S. Navy warship already committed forward. Ahead, a tanker locked the corridor. To the sides, small hulls closed distance fast enough to matter. In one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, there was no room to turn without consequence, and for a moment it looked like the pressure was working, like the ship was being shaped, forced to react inside a space it didn't control. But that was only what could be seen, because while the boats were closing in, something else was already taking shape, and control may have started shifting long before anyone realized it. Chapter 1: Crisis Entry. The waterway was already tightening before the ship ever slowed down. Gray hull cutting forward, USS Tripoli moved into the narrow lane. No wide maneuvering space. No room to turn without consequence. Ahead, a civilian tanker held its line, heavy, slow, and impossible to ignore. And then movement. Small wakes slicing across the surface, fast boats already inside the corridor, not approaching from distance, but positioned where the path narrowed most. They weren't arriving. They were already there. One cut across the forward arc, close enough to force attention. Another drifted along the flank, holding distance, just inside reaction range. From above it might have looked scattered. From the deck it felt deliberate. Angles forming, space shrinking, options quietly disappearing. Tripoli held course. No sudden turn, no visible escalation. Just forward movement through a corridor that was no longer neutral. And that was the first problem. The tanker ahead reduced speed variation. It fixed the lane, locked the path into something predictable, something easier to shape. The boats adjusted, not rushing in all at once but shifting positions, cutting shallow angles across the bow, forcing small, almost invisible corrections. Each move alone meant nothing. Together they began to define the space. Distance started to matter. Not miles, not even hundreds of meters. Now it was seconds. Closing gaps that couldn't be ignored but not yet crossed. And that was the pressure. Not a strike, not a warning shot, but a narrowing of choices happening faster than it looked. Inside that lane, size became a liability. Tripoli wasn't a destroyer. It carried weight, presence, consequence. And in confined water, that meant less freedom to react. The boats understood that. They stayed just outside escalation, just inside influence. Close enough to shape movement, far enough to avoid a trigger. On the surface, nothing had happened yet. No collision, no command shouted over open channels, no sudden turn to break contact. But the geometry was changing, and it was changing fast. Because this wasn't a transit anymore. It wasn't routine movement through a known choke point. It was a controlled space being quietly rewritten in real time. And Tripoli was already inside it. This wasn't a deployment. It was already a problem. Chapter 2: Strategic Gamble. The first shift wasn't speed, it was position. More boats began to appear along the forward arc, not rushing in but sliding into gaps that hadn't existed seconds before. One to port, two more off the bow, another drifting just wide enough to close the angle. The space ahead started to fill, not crowded, not chaotic, but controlled piece by piece until forward movement carried a cost, and then one moved closer. A single fast boat cut across the bow, tight enough to force attention, tight enough to demand a decision. Tripoli adjusted, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to avoid the crossing line, just enough to stay inside safe margin. But that was the second problem, because the adjustment wasn't isolated. The moment speed changed, the geometry shifted with it. The tanker ahead held steady, but the space between everything else began to compress. And the boats followed, not chasing matching.
Adopting the same stable pattern.
Holding relative position, mirroring movement, keeping the pressure exactly where it needed to be. On the surface, it looked like reaction, but the pattern said something else. More contacts edged inward, angles tightened further. The forward arc narrowed into a channel that no longer belonged to open water. It belonged to whoever could define it, and right now that didn't look like the ship. Another boat drifted in from starboard, closing distance without crossing a line. Another held slightly behind, cutting off the space that had just been adjusted. Each move was small, each one defensible. But together they began to remove options. Speed became constrained. Course became predictable. Every correction fed the next position, and the corridor started to feel owned.
Captain.
Tripoli remained steady. No aggressive turn, no visible escalation, only controlled movement through a space that was tightening with every second. Behind and off to the flank, the escort destroyer held formation, close enough to support, far enough to avoid crowding the lane. And that restraint mattered, because the absence of reaction looked like hesitation. No warnings blared across the water, no intercept maneuver to break the pattern, no visible attempt to push the boats back, just discipline. But from the outside, that wasn't what it looked like. It looked like space being taken, boat by boat, angle by angle distance, shrinking without resistance. The forward arc was no longer open. It was being shaped, defined not by force but by positioning. And every second that passed, that definition became stronger. Because this wasn't about closing distance anymore. It was about controlling direction, where the ship could go, how fast it could move, what options remained when space ran out. And that was the illusion. That the swarm wasn't just applying pressure, it was taking control of the encounter itself. They weren't just approaching, they were shaping where the ship could go. Chapter 3, Hidden Battlefield Picture. On the surface, the boats kept closing.
Captain, they're targeting
Angles
the main
tightening
reactor.
distances,
Shields are
compressing
failing.
movement that looked increasingly aggressive, as if control was slipping with every second. But below that surface, a different picture was forming. On the radar screens, those scattered contacts weren't scattered anymore. Each return began to align, falling into tracks that could be followed. Not random, not chaotic, structured. One vector from port,
Multiple bogies
another
aligning.
crossing
Bearing
shallow from
090.
starboard, a third holding
hands
just
to battle
outside the
stations.
bow line waiting for the next adjustment. And that changed everything. Because once movement becomes pattern, it becomes readable. Inside the ship, no sudden reaction came, no rush to break formation, no aggressive turn to clear the arc. Instead, stillness, measured observation, contacts updating, speed and bearing calculated in silence. And that was the part no one outside could see, because the closer the boats moved, the tighter their vectors became. The tighter the vectors became, the easier they were to predict. What looked like pressure was becoming structure. Another boat edged forward, cutting a slightly sharper angle than before. But instead of forcing a reaction, it confirmed something already suspected. The convergence wasn't expanding, it was narrowing. Tripoli adjusted, but not in the way it appeared. A slight change in speed, barely noticeable from the outside, just enough to stretch one interval, just enough to compress another. The boats followed, and in that following, they revealed more. Spacing between them tightened unevenly. Some drifted closer than others. Some held just beyond a line they never quite crossed. And that line mattered, because inside that invisible band reaction time collapsed. Seconds became fractions. Movement became commitment. And the boats were moving into it. Not all at once, not deliberately enough to trigger alarm, but consistently enough to define where the threshold sat. Inside the command space, that threshold was already marked. Not announced, not acted on, but understood. A distance where influence turned into risk, where pressure could no longer stay ambiguous, where one more adjustment would no longer be optional, and still no escalation, no warning broadcast across open channels, no visible push to break the pattern. Only controlled movement, subtle spacing changes that looked like compliance, but weren't. Because every small adjustment shifted the geometry just enough to test the pattern's stability, and the pattern held, which meant something else was true. The swarm wasn't adapting freely, it was committing to its own structure. Following positions it believed were controlling the space, and that belief was making it predictable. The closer they moved, the more their options narrowed. The more they narrowed, the more the pattern locked in place. What looked like tightening pressure was becoming fixed geometry, and fixed geometry can be read, it can be measured, and eventually it can be controlled. But not yet, because the distance hadn't fully closed. The threshold hadn't been crossed. The moment hadn't arrived. Not on the surface. Out there, it still looked like the swarm was shaping everything. Still looked like the ship was reacting. Still looked like control belonged to the side closing in. But inside that narrowing band, something else was already decided. The closer they got, the more predictable they became. Chapter 4. The reversal. The distance finally collapsed. One boat pushed just inside the line, closing faster than the others, cutting across the forward arc where reaction time disappeared. Another followed. Not coordinated in appearance, but close enough to compress the space into something that could no longer be ignored. That was the threshold. No signal, no visible warning. Just a point where influence became commitment. And in that instant, everything changed. Tripoli moved. Not sharply, not violently, but decisively. A controlled shift in heading, paired with a precise increase in speed, timed to the exact moment the geometry locked too tight. At the same time, the escort destroyer adjusted, not trailing anymore, not observing. It stepped into the space, closing the offset angle, tightening formation in a way that hadn't existed seconds before. And that was the break. Because the swarm had been built on predictable spacing, on the assumption that movement would stay reactive. But this wasn't reactive, it was synchronized. Tripoli's forward motion stretched the arc. The destroyer's shift compressed the flank. Together they reshaped the corridor faster than the boats could adapt. One boat veered off first, a sudden correction pulling away from the bow line to avoid crossing too far inside. Another hesitated, caught between maintaining position and avoiding collision geometry that no longer matched the pattern. And then the alignment broke. Not gradually. Not piece by piece, all at once, because the pattern they had formed only worked under one condition, that the ship would keep reacting. But it didn't. The moment that assumption failed, every position lost its meaning. Boats that had been closing now had to open distance. Angles that had been tightening now created risk instead of control. The forward arc cleared, not completely, but enough. Enough to restore maneuver, enough to force separation. And that separation spread through the swarm, each unit adjusting independently now, each one breaking alignment to avoid crossing another's path. What had looked like coordination revealed its weakness. It wasn't flexible, it was committed, and commitment at the wrong moment turns into exposure. Tripoli held the new line, steady, controlled, now moving through a corridor that was opening again. The destroyer maintained position, not chasing, not escalating, just holding the geometry that had reset the space. No warning shots, no aggressive pursuit, just control, quiet, precise, undeniable. And on the surface it happened almost too fast to follow. One moment the swarm defined the corridor, the next it was breaking itself apart, because the control had never been in the pressure. It had been in the timing, in the moment when reaction stopped and decision began. The moment it looked irreversible, it reversed. Chapter 5. Strategic consequence. The boats began to drift, not retreating all at once, not breaking contact completely, but pulling away from each other, losing the alignment they had just held. One widened its arc to port. Another slowed, falling back behind the line. A third turned outward, opening distance that hadn't existed before. The formation was gone, not destroyed, not forced back by aggression, just undone. And that was the result. Because once the pattern collapsed, coordination couldn't recover at speed. Each unit had to reset independently, each movement now isolated instead of linked. Distance increased, not dramatically at first, but steadily, second by second, meter by meter, and with that distance, control disappeared. The forward arc opened again. The corridor widened. Options returned to the ship that had never visibly fought for them. Tripoli continued forward. Same heading, same controlled speed. No surge, no signal of escalation, just movement through water that no longer resisted it. And that absence mattered. No warning shots followed. No aggressive pursuit to exploit the break. No attempt to push the boats farther back. Because the objective wasn't to escalate. It had already been achieved. The swarm didn't regroup. It couldn't not without rebuilding the structure it had just exposed. And that exposure was the real outcome. Because everything that had looked like pressure had revealed something else underneath. The way the boats approached, the distances they preferred, the angles they held under constraint. All of it had formed a pattern, and that pattern had been read, not guessed, not assumed, observed, confirmed, and then tested at the exact moment it became fixed. That was the shift, not in firepower, not in aggression, but in understanding. Because once the pattern was clear, control didn't require force, it required timing. And timing turned pressure into something predictable, something that could be shaped. and then reversed. Tripoli moved deeper into the strait. The tanker ahead still held its line, still defining the corridor in physical terms. But the invisible structure around it was no longer contested. What had felt like a constrained space now moved with the ship. Quiet, controlled, open again. And that was the part no one outside would see. That the deployment itself was never just movement. It was a question. A test placed directly into the corridor, forcing a response that couldn't stay hidden. Forcing behavior into the open until it became measurable. Because they didn't send Tripoli into danger, they sent it to create it. At the beginning it looked like pressure. Fast boats inside a narrowing lane, forcing a larger ship into smaller choices in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. But that was only the surface, because the control never belonged to the side that moved first. It belonged to the side that understood what those movements revealed. The swarm didn't lose because it was weaker. It lost the moment its pattern became visible, the moment its own pressure fixed it in place. And when that moment came, the reversal was already decided. Tripoli didn't fight its way through the corridor. It moved through a space that had already been taken back. Out on the water, the boats were still there, wider now, separated, uncertain. And at the center of it all, the ship kept its course, cutting forward through open water that for a moment had only seemed contested.